Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul are some of the best tragedies in recent television. The stories of each show depict a man, influenced by his surroundings, slowly sinking deeper and deeper into depravity as they both become more and more engrossed in criminal behavior and their own concepts of status and success. Better Call Saul is the prequel to Breaking Bad, so it serves the dual role of being its own story while also fleshing out the characters of the prior show in interesting ways that will still keep the future characters intact. This is done, namely, with the titular Saul Goodman, aka Jimmy McGill. The story of Jimmy McGill, as shown in Better Call Saul, paints a much bleaker picture of what was previously a character that mainly served as comic relief in most cases. The show shows a gradual decline of a former criminal trying to better himself as a lawyer, but constantly being pushed and pulled between his old habits and the right thing, eventually leading him to losing everything he once had. The show does this by establishing Jimmy's old life before his days as Saul Goodman, including the people who are in his life. One of these characters is not only crucial to Jimmy's development, but also arguably one of, if not the most innocent and tragic characters in the entire series, Breaking Bad included. That character's name is Howard Hamlin. Howard George Hamlin is the son of George Hamlin, of Hamlin McGill, where Howard now serves as senior partner at one of the top law firms in the state of New Mexico. Howard is a very charismatic individual, even being called a salesman at one point, but not in the way you might think. He's not some slimeball, silver-tongued snake of a lawyer, but rather his demeanor is a lot more kind, open, and inviting. In particular, I find the way that he speaks very interesting. The specific tone and cadence of which he speaks is something I've always found oddly captivating. And that's owed all to Patrick Fabian's performance as Howard. In general, Patrick Fabian is one of the most underrated acting talents in this show, even when he's up against such steep competition. Howard as a person and as a lawyer is very different from what we first think. At first, Jimmy and us as an audience by proxy think that Howard is the standard conniving asshole hotshot lawyer that's all but a cliche at this point. After all, we know very early on that he was brought into the firm by his dad, so we have this sense that Howard has always had a silver spoon in his mouth. Throughout season 1, Howard seems to be the main antagonist to Jimmy. This is shown by Howard's general disapproval towards Jimmy's stunts, like bursting into the conference room unannounced, the billboard stunt, and even getting HHM's high-profile client after HHM was fired. Speaking of which, we are also shown Howard landing said high-profile client that Jimmy tried to get earlier that same day. Just as how Jimmy tried to get the Kettlemans, but they went to Howard instead, they go to Jimmy after Howard is fired. Both of them are naturally frustrated with losing the client, but none of this is malicious. It's just part of the job for being a lawyer seeking clientele. Similarly, Howard was eager to take Jimmy's class action lawsuit that he founded, but Howard is unwilling to work with Jimmy. This is a parallel to earlier in season 1, where after Jimmy got his bar license, it was Howard who broke the news to Jimmy that he wouldn't be continuing at the firm. In both cases, Howard was just a messenger for someone else's wishes, but we'll get to him later. This business-centric attitude is also shown when Howard later tries to retain Mesa Verde, a bank branch that Kim Wexler, more on her later, single-handedly brought in herself as she leaves HHM. Already, we get the impression that Howard plays the field when it comes to his lawyering, but that's just standard for the job. What isn't standard is how he acts as a person. Howard as a person is a very kind and caring individual. He generously helps Chuck, again, more on him later, through his illness, and even pays off Kim's student debt when she goes through law school, and when Kim leaves HHM, he waives the rest of her debt as a thank you. It becomes very clear, especially in season 3, that Howard makes the moves that he makes with his clients out of the goodness for the firm, not because of any vendetta or any sense of greed. On top of that, given that this show is in the Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul universe, most of the characters in this show are either closely related to criminals or are criminals themselves. Howard is one of the noticeable exceptions to this, being that he doesn't break many laws. The worst thing he does in the entire series is trespass. That's it. From most standpoints, Howard is an overall good and kind person. While I maintain Howard is the most morally and legally correct person of the main cast in Better Call Saul, he is not perfect. Despite typically being well-meaning, a lot of the time he can come across as insensitive or condescending. It's usually unintentional, but it is still a pattern of behavior that leads to unfortunate and oftentimes preventable outcomes. He is also a deeply protective person, whether it be his friends, family, or his law firm, HHM. One of the moments of his overprotective nature come in relation to how he treats Kim Wexler. Kim Wexler is a lawyer at HHM and Jimmy's girlfriend throughout most of the show. She is a smart, empathetic, and deeply tragic character in her own right, who often bears a lot of the brunt of Jimmy's actions. In relation to Howard, one of the larger instances of this is when Jimmy runs an unsanctioned commercial advertising the law firm he joined at Howard's recommendation. Since the commercial portrayed Jimmy's firm unfavorably, and that firm is partners with HHM on the class action lawsuit, Jimmy's commercial is also a blow against HHM. However, since Jimmy and Kim are close, and Jimmy had shown Kim the commercial beforehand, Kim knew about this commercial and did nothing to stop it. Or at least that's how Howard sees it. As such, as misplaced as it is, Kim gets relegated to doc review by Howard for weeks, if not months on end. Even when Kim gets Mesa Verde, a major bank, as a client for the firm, that is not enough to get Howard to view Kim favorably. At least, not at first. He eventually lets Kim back into his graces, and the two resume a relatively positive and professional relationship for a time before she leaves HHM to pursue solo practice. Part of the reason she has for that rebound is thanks to Chuck. The character who is undoubtedly tied the most to Howard Hamlin is his law partner and best friend, Charles Chuck McGill, older brother to Jimmy McGill. Chuck is an absolutely brilliant lawyer with an iron grasp on even the most obscure case law, making him one of the most impressive individuals in his field. However, late into his career, Chuck developed something called EMS, which stands for electromagnetic hypersensitivity, or basically an allergy to electricity. This is later shown to be a mental illness that gets more and more severe the more stress he's under, but that doesn't make it any less real. Chuck is also, to put it bluntly, an asshole. Even though Chuck is a genius, he is also incredibly spiteful, egotistical, and vindictive, especially against his brother Jimmy, whom he has resented and looked down on for most of their lives. Chuck believes with every fiber of his being that Jimmy is a scumbag and that he is unfit to be a lawyer. This is predicated on the fact that Jimmy used to be a delinquent in his earlier years before moving out to New Mexico. Even after Jimmy set himself straight, got a legitimate job, went to law school, passed the bar, and became a lawyer, Chuck still viewed Jimmy as nothing more than his earlier criminal self. His viewpoint isn't unfounded, but it is stubborn and unwilling to change, even when presented with clear evidence to the contrary. Chuck is a lawyer in the criminal justice system, and yet he is adamant against the most basic viewpoints of reformation. This pattern of viewing Jimmy at his absolute worst is at its peak when Jimmy tampered with Chuck's documents in order to get HHM dropped by Mesa Verde so that they would go with Kim instead. While it is true that Jimmy did all the things that Chuck accused him of, the problem is that Chuck had no evidence to support any of it.
My evidence is knowing my brother for his entire life.
He isn't basing this accusation off anything tangible or even reasonable. His accusation is based on the fact that his brother was a scumbag, that he is a scumbag, and that he always will be a scumbag. This vendetta is later exposed during Jimmy's bar hearing, where Jimmy has to prove that while he did break down Chuck's door and threaten him, that he did not tamper with his documents. The way Jimmy and Kim do this is by framing the confession as Jimmy trying to talk down his mentally ill brother, and they also do something more extreme. They plant a battery in Chuck's jacket, proving once and for all that his illness isn't something real, but something manifested as Chuck's stress and anger towards Jimmy.
And he gets to be a lawyer? What a sick joke!
While I could make an entire video dissecting Chuck McGill and all the great work that went into his character from a writing and acting standpoint, he isn't the subject of this video. Throughout the entire show, Howard supports Chuck almost without question. He sends Chuck money while he's debilitated by his illness. He respects Chuck's wishes to not have Jimmy working at the firm as a lawyer, and when presented with a confession from Jimmy that he did in fact tamper with Chuck's documents, Howard helps to try to bring Jimmy into the light and expose him and hold him accountable for his crimes, both real and alleged. But the thing is here, Howard isn't doing any of this out of hatred for Jimmy. He is doing it out of genuine love and support of Chuck, his partner and best friend. This is shown multiple times where Howard expresses regret over passing over Jimmy, or by Howard actively complimenting Jimmy and all the work he has done as a lawyer and all that he has done for Chuck, even recommending Jimmy to another high-end law firm for a partner track position. Howard, at least at this point, has no disdain for Jimmy. Nothing that Howard is doing is out of malice. Even when Howard is actively going against Jimmy in his bar hearing arc, he is doing it because he was presented with very real evidence that Jimmy might have done something illegal, and then he witnesses Jimmy doing something illegal with his very eyes. None of that is born from malice like Chuck's vendetta. Eventually, as Chuck spirals, Chuck threatens HHM with legal action after Howard suggests retirement in academia as a future for Chuck instead of as a practicing attorney. Chuck forces Howard to either keep Chuck as his partner, pay out Chuck's partnership agreement, effectively bankrupting the entire firm, or see Chuck in court, which Howard knows Chuck will win. At that point, when Chuck threatens Howard's firm, he is naturally quick to defend it. Howard decides to pay Chuck's partnership agreement, but to make sure that the firm doesn't go under, he takes out several loans in order to keep the firm afloat while paying off Chuck. While Howard loves and supports Chuck, he is not blinded by his feelings, and he is willing to do what it takes to ensure the best outcome for the greater good, even at his own literal expense. After Chuck's suicide, Howard becomes racked with guilt, thinking that he pushed his best friend to suicide. Between HHM going downhill as a result of losing his senior partner and paying out Chuck's estate, Jimmy being suspended, and Kim no longer working at HHM, Howard largely leaves Jimmy and Kim's lives, aside from the occasional post-mortem related event. Eventually, when Howard and HHM as a whole recovers, Howard meets with Jimmy and offers him a job. Putting the past behind him and seeing Jimmy, now Saul, rebound after his license gets renewed, Howard sees Jimmy's work and talent again. The only difference is that now Chuck isn't around to downplay and turn down Jimmy's work. Jimmy, holding on to the past, responds to Howard's genuine offer with a series of pranks, like throwing bowling balls at his car and sending prostitutes to his work lunches. When Howard catches on that it's Jimmy doing this, his response isn't legal action or retaliation. Instead, he goes to Kim, genuinely worried that Jimmy is spiraling like Chuck did. That said, true to his pattern with Kim, Howard addresses this in an unlikable way, where he comes across not like he's trying to save Jimmy, but save Kim from Jimmy, which given Kim's slow involvement with Jimmy's schemes over the course of the show, Kim gets defensive and shuts him down completely. This event sparks a massive plot with Jimmy and Kim, wherein they try to get Jimmy's old class action lawsuit settled so that Jimmy can become a millionaire. The plot involves a series of elaborate steps to paint Howard Hamlin as a drug addict. Howard eventually catches wind of the plot and tries to stop it, but he ends up playing into the plot even further by doing so. Despite being nothing but kind to the two of them post Chuck's death, he is still subjugated to an elaborate smear campaign for seemingly no reason. Jimmy and Kim did something similar with Chuck in order to get a lesser sentence at the bar hearing, but the difference is that Chuck was trying to either get Jimmy expelled as a lawyer or sent to jail outright. There were stakes that made it so Jimmy and Kim had to defend Jimmy from Chuck, even if they defended him in a morally and legally dubious way. Here, Jimmy and Kim have no reason to go after Howard except for their own vendettas and personal gain. And what's worse? It works. Despite almost always trying to be the bigger person, almost always trying to be kind and reasonable, because of a few mistakes that he made, he still has his life ruined in the end. Sure, at times he came off wrong, and one time he held a grudge against Kim, perhaps maybe too long, but he grew and changed and always tried to get things back on track. And we aren't even done yet. After the lawsuit gets settled, Howard goes to confront Jimmy and Kim, and there we see just how ruined Howard is. He already had so much baggage, so many problems before Jimmy and Kim dragged him through the mud out of nowhere, and he rightfully demands an explanation. While he isn't told it outright, he learns that they didn't even do it for the money itself. Jimmy and Kim did what they did because they felt like it, because they could, because it was fun for them. This is the most important scene to Howard's character because we truly see just how much he has suffered and just how little he deserves any of this. And then it gets even worse. As tensions have escalated on the drug side of Better Call Saul, Lalo Salamanca, one of the leaders of the Mexican cartel, survived an assassination attempt after fleeing indictment in America. Having recently worked with Jimmy multiple times, and being referred to Jimmy by Nacho, the guy responsible for the attempt on Lalo's life, Lalo has his sights on Jimmy for his part in all of this. As Howard lays into Jimmy and Kim, Lalo comes in. Jimmy and Kim start to cower in fear, and as Lalo readies his gun, Howard is concerned and frightened. And there's one moment that always speaks to me.
Oh, is that right? You want some advice? Find better lawyers.
Howard, please just turn around.
No. Take your time.
What's this about?
Since the night I saw this scene, this one line has always stuck with me. Even after all the things he's been put through, after all the slander, all the plots, all the conniving bullshit that's standard for Jimmy Saul Goodman McGill, there's this brief flash where Howard is concerned for Jimmy and Kim. Even as he actively has a motive to hate them, it still seems like he cares about Jimmy and Kim. Even in this moment, there's this brief reminder that Howard, at the end of the day, is a deeply caring and protective person, even if he doesn't always know how to show it the right way. But that isn't enough to save him. The impact of this death on Saul and Kim is immediate and indicative of the real Howard Hamlin. For Saul, this is the moment to truly break him as he tries to do what he did with Chuck and his recent criminal behavior. He tries to move on without processing any of it, fully becoming the scumbag lawyer Saul Goodman that we are all accustomed to seeing in Breaking Bad. After all, he just saw someone who used to be his boss, his peer, and at times even his friend get killed for something he wasn't even remotely involved with. So what else could go wrong? For Kim, this moment breaks her in the complete opposite direction. After slowly becoming more and more corrupt as the series went on, seeing Howard get shot snaps her back into reality. The guilt of this moment causes her to resign as a lawyer, leave New Mexico, and begin a life as a bored Floridian wife working an office job for a sprinkler company. Seeing Howard, who is not only her boss, but also her mentor, get shot because of her and Jimmy's actions, completely breaks Kim as a person, and she carries that guilt through to the future post-Breaking Bad, where she tries to turn herself in for Howard's murder. But it's not just the immediate aftermath that makes Howard's death so unfair. It's the wide disproportionality of his own actions and the fate that he suffers. Not all characters are written equally. Some characters do far worse things than others and get away with their lives. Jesse helped just as much in Walter's drug ring as Walter himself, even having multiple murders of his own under his belt, but he gets away to pursue a better life. Some characters do far lesser actions and get far worse punishment. Some characters like Andrea, Gail, and Werner were almost always completely good people who haven't done anything anywhere near close to the actions of the main characters, but by the end of their series, they wind up dead and buried just the same. I bring up these three characters because while they are good, albeit morally flawed individuals, at the end of the day, they were still in some way involved in criminal activity, or at least associated with people who were. Howard, on the other hand, by the midpoint of season 5, he is almost completely out of Jimmy and Kim's lives, save for a few run-ins here and there. That is, he was out of their lives until Jimmy and Kim ruined his life for a payday and a thrill ride, which then led to his death due to the worst possible timing ever. The only characters in either show who stack up against Howard's lack of crime and ill intent are Walter Jr. and Brock from Breaking Bad, both of whom are children. At almost every turn, Howard is acting not just rationally, but thoughtfully to the people around him. When Jimmy is good, he commends him for it and sings his praises. When Jimmy is bad, he tries to stop him as ethically as possible. Throughout all of it, Howard is neither unlawful nor is he malicious, especially not towards Jimmy. Despite being someone who almost always tries his best to please the people closest to him, it always falls short. In the end, save for a few moments of unlikability, Howard suffers the most as a result of the least severe actions possible. Howard is consistently one of the most morally, ethically, and legally good characters of Breaking Bad, and yet he is gunned down regardless. And in my mind, there is no greater tragedy than that.